Space makes old metal sound like an animal. When the clamps bit down, the derelict station shuddered through our hull and the deck plates vibrated under my boots. A long, dry groan that settled in my bones. Frost crawled across the inner viewport, in a spiderweb of white, crystallizing my breath to a pale fog that refused to leave. Beyond it, the station hung black against the starfield. Ribs of truss, broken solar vanes like molted wings, docking ring yawning open. From this angle, it didn't look engineered. It looked exhumed. I ran the checklist again because repetition is cheaper than panic. Pressure equalization, green. Atmosphere, thin, stale, volatile organics detected. Structural integrity, marginal. Power, intermittent. Emergency bus flickering. No beacon, no transponder, no ownership tag. Just the silent glow of something not quite dead. I told Sparks to keep the cutter on a short tether. I told Vance to watch the pressure delta. I told myself this was salvage, a routine latch and collect. That I hadn't brought us here for any reason except the oxygen cylinders and the copper wiring, and the possibility of something to pawn that didn't ask questions when we sold it. Our docking collar kissed steel with a hollow ring. The seals quivered, then locked, and a thin ribbon of frost crawled around the rim as the station's cold swallowed our heat. The world narrowed to the sound of fans in my helmet and the low thud of my heartbeat. Too loud in the confined space, too deliberate. When the inner light cycled from red to yellow, Sparks chuckled, an unconvincing sound. "Hear that?" he said. "Old girl's still breathing." He meant it as a joke. The station made a slow, tidal sound, air moving where it shouldn't, pipes expanding and contracting a fraction with lingering heat. It was a trick of metal and vacuum, but the cadence lived too close to a rib cage. It was easy to imagine the walls flexing. I cracked the hatch and stale air rolled in. Cold, wet metal and old grease, undertoned with a sweetness that clung to the throat like bruised fruit. The emergency strips along the corridor blinked to life, 1 out of 4, then none, and shadows moved with the delay. We stepped across, boots thudding on grates. The station's skin had a fine dust to it that clung to the soles and hissed when we lifted off. Paint flaked from the bulkheads in strips, exposing dull gray beneath, etched with maintenance glyphs I didn't recognize. The head-up in my visor tagged every panel and vent. The tags returned null. My breath fogged my visor and refused to clear. I lowered the output of the suit heater and cold pressed close, finding the gaps. 10 minutes, I said. I don't know why I always tell them that. We never finish in 10. Power's there, Vance said, reading the station's heartbeat on his slate. He kept his voice level like he was in a classroom instead of a corpse. Emergency bus flickering every 9 seconds. Like a pulse. Like a pulse, Sparks echoed. He reached out and tapped the wall with a gloved knuckle. A hollow, resonant note came back from somewhere inside the station and he laughed once, soft, still breathing. Stop saying that, I said. We moved in. The corridor ahead took a shallow curve. It was the color of old teeth, scraped shiny in the centers where bodies had brushed past and left the metal polished. The further we went, the more the air smelled like a closed locker, damp cloth, overnight breath. My lamp cut a tunnel through the dark. Within it, the dust moved, not stirred by us, that I could calculate. It moved like a weather system, the slow drift of microscopic particles with nowhere to settle, swirling when the emergency lights hiccuped back on. Someone had left a mug on a console, ceramic chipped on the rim, fused to the surface by its own, long-dried spill. It had left a ring like an eclipse. On the wall above, a map of the station. The ink had bled into the coating and the edges had softened until every corridor looked like a vein. My comms crackled once, a whisper, then stilled. I checked the channel menu. No incoming transmission, no carrier wave. Just a single spike of static that sounded like the first syllable of my name. The rational part of me, the part that writes lists, counts rations, has learned how to forget without making a ceremony of it, filed the glitch into a drawer and shut it. If I'd told them why the station bothered me, they'd have laughed or gone quiet. Both would have been worse, so I didn't say it. I didn't say it looked like the inside of someone's skull. "Captain," Vance said softly, not in my ear but right behind me. He hated saying my name. I turned. The viewport at the junction. Junction 3 corridors, a triangular opening with a reflective strip along its frame. In that strip, 4 figures stood in our circle of light. Me, Sparks, Vance, and something tall behind us in the dark, limbs too long for the suit we were wearing, head wrong, elongated like a melted helmet. I pivoted, lamp washing over bare bulkhead and a ladder empty and cold. When I looked back at the strip, the 4th figure was gone. The slate pinged. Sparks was already at a panel, prying it open with the flat of his cutter. "If she's got a basic grit alive," he said, "I can piggyback a handshake, get the emergency lights to hold steady." "Do it fast," I said. The dust had begun to settle on my glove. When I brushed my index finger against my thumb, fine grit squeaked, a sound like teeth on foil. I couldn't shake the idea it was not dust, that it was the memory of something burned too hot and forever incomplete. Sparks wedged the panel and spat a cable into the gap. The station's lights surged. For a moment the corridor was bright enough to hurt, and the room appeared crisp and detailed. The scoring along the floor where something heavy had been dragged. The smears along the wall at shoulder height, 3 long arcs like someone had tried to wipe their hands clean and given up. A set of prints bare, no glove, no tread, too many bones, committed in rust. Then the power dipped again and left after images that refused to blink away. "Grid is crude," Sparks said, voice tightening as his slate threw errors. "Language is not standard. I can't." "Something's wrong with pressure," Vance said. He was staring at numbers that didn't agree with each other. "We've got outgassing in the ring. It's equalizing backwards." The station took a breath. The sound ran down the corridor from the ports like a low wave, washing through an empty building. The pipes above our heads released a thin white plume, then sucked it back as if embarrassed. The frost on my visor grew fern patterns for a heartbeat and then receded, leaving the plastic clammy and clean. 10 minutes, I said again, because I needed it not to matter. "Sparks, get us something steady. Vance, mark us a path, in and out." I stepped to the junction and peered left. The emergency strips there were dead, and the dark looked not just unlit but full, like a liquid you could pour. My lamp probed it and returned with less than it should, as if photons had gone missing en route. The right-hand corridor was better, scattered, hazard paint. A crate overturned, a pressure suit slumped against the wall like a shed skin. The helmet was spiderwebbed and the inside was dark. I didn't look at it long. A shape crossed the far end of the right-hand corridor. It moved like a man adapting to low gravity, slow and precise, shoulders avoiding a protruding pipe by muscle, memory. I took a step forward, raising a hand without thinking, and then stopped because fresh dust would have given him away. He left none. When my lamp reached the corner, the corridor was empty. "I saw someone," I said. The admission felt like a catheter. It snaked in cold and precise and kept me from drowning. 30 meters ahead, heading starboard. Vance gave a single involuntary laugh. "Who?" "Sir, there's no biosigns on—" "Someone," I repeated. We all listened. In the quiet, our fans sounded like wind through a winter tree. Then we heard something else. The whisper of fabric on metal, distant like someone dragging a sleeve across a railing in slow motion. We advanced because fear alone doesn't steer a body. Orders do. The corridor narrowed. The walls had a seam, down the center that my lamp kept catching on. A faint line as though plates had been pushed together too quickly and the weld was still fresh. Flakes of whatever composed the station's skin had curled up at the edges, like a scab. I reached out, gloved fingers brushing the seam. It was warm. "Heat," I said. The word lodged in the back of my throat. "There's a gradient." Sparks had to stretch to see, and for a second his shoulders bunched like a man trying not to reach into a hole in the ground. He touched the seam and hissed. "Alive," he said, and I couldn't tell if he meant the panel or himself. He shook his hand and the dust came away in wet clumps clinging to the glove like pulp. "Back to the bay," I said. "We regroup. The station's sound changed. The ragged sucking became a clear, even inhale. Somewhere in the superstructure, a relay clicked like a knuckle cracking. The light steadied. Every shadow sharpened. For the first time since we'd crossed, the corridor looked like a place built with intent. And standing at the far end, just within the reach of my lamp, was a figure in a suit. It was our model. The same layers, the same harness, the same shattered decal on the shoulder, but taller, wrong by a handspan at every joint, as though someone had miscopied an anatomy diagram, stretched the femurs, added a vertebra. The helmet's faceplate reflected my lamp back like a dull eye. It raised a hand slowly, palm out. A greeting. I lifted my own on instinct and stopped. There was dust drifting in the space between us in slow, lazy spirals. The kind of dust that moves when you move. The kind of dust that would swirl if the thing across from you actually displaces air. It didn't stir. The dust hung undisturbed, looping in its own weather, touching nothing. My mouth went dry. I dropped my hand. The helmet tilted. Curious. Too curious. Then the lights hiccuped again and the figure vanished with the darkness, as if it had been drawn on and someone had blinked and the ink forgot to dry. Vance swore. Sparks choked out a laugh that died at the top of his throat. My heart cracked against my ribs like a tool dropped on a deck plate. "Back," I said, and the word tasted like I'd bitten into a battery. We turned as a unit and moved, not running because running makes noise and invites the universe to play. The corridor opened to the bay. Our ship rested across the collar, a constant shape that made sense. The bay door gaped open to starlight, the edge of the ring limned in ice. The console next to the hatch threw error codes that scrolled too fast to read. Sparks reached for it, and I caught his wrist. He looked at me, the lamp turning the glass of his visor into a blank mask. I felt his pulse through the glove, quick, strong, unaware of its own deadline. "Don't," I said. "I didn't touch it," he said. He hadn't. The station took another breath, long and slow, as if filling its lungs. The bay hummed. The door moved. It slid down from the ceiling with a deliberate, patient certainty. No grind, no shriek of abused metal. Only a series of soft clicks as locks found each other and decided they belonged. Our suit lamps lit the descending slab in a pale gradient. I could see our ship's beacon strobing beyond it, a calm heartbeat going out into the dark, one we could no longer answer. "Manual override," Vance said, already at the console, fingers on dead keys. It's not me. I swear." "I know," I said, but the words came from a long way away, like I was hearing myself on a recording. I took 2 steps toward the narrowing gap on principle, because you move toward the exit until the exit proves it isn't yours. The cold radiating from the closing door bit through my suit and took a layer of heat I couldn't afford to lose. On the far side of the bay, where the light didn't reach, something moved. Not a flicker from a sensor panel, not the subtle settling of old metal adjusting to load. It was weight shifting, a long frame uncoiling from behind a stack of crates, joints clicking quiet as knuckles, head lifting to scent air through a helmet that didn't breathe. My lamp washed that way and it arrested mid-rise, then melted backward into the dark like a shadow, learning it wasn't attached. The door's final inch came down soundless. I could have put my hand in that closing space. I could have tested the sensor, flirted with the clean, crushing geometry of it. I stood and watched it do what it wanted. The last slice of our ship's light narrowed to a line, then a thread, then nothing. The seals engaged with a soft, absolute sigh. My comm went very quiet. The station listened to itself breathe. I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful left to say. Sparks shifted beside me, the cutter's pilot light a faint ember. Vance's glove hovered over the dead panel like a man not sure if he'd been the one to turn it off. The cold settled into my teeth. The frost on the viewport began to grow again. delicate ferns consuming glass, reclaiming the shape of the world to something hard and uninviting. I listened for the sound you only hear once you've been locked in. Not the scream, not yet. The other sound, the soft weight of a footfall from somewhere above the bay, patient and careful, as if whatever had been waiting did not want to startle us. In the sudden, deliberate quiet the station inhaled. Something moved in the rafters, the air never moved. It sat in the corridors like water, thick and chemical, tasting of rust, ozone, and something sweet that clung to the back of the throat long after I swallowed. Our lamps cut cones through the dark, beams scattering against broken consoles, shattered glass and dangling cables that hissed faintly when brushed, yet the machines around us flickered as though freshly disturbed. Every cracked screen blinked with static, humming at a frequency too close to human breath. We split up. I said the rule, never separate, 3 times. Then I stopped saying it. Oxygen canisters meant hours, not days. The ship's recycled air was already stale with our panic. Survival wasn't about rules anymore. It was about taking chances before the walls closed in. I turned left at the junction and found the medbay. Its doors fought before opening, a juddering sigh that blew dust across my visor. Inside, straps unbuckled, stretchers bent, IV bags drained, to a syrup at the bottom. The room stank of dried copper and old antiseptic. My lamp followed the stains up the wall across the ceiling where the pattern broke logic. Blood sprayed in a wide fan as though someone had floated upward before, tearing apart. I stopped breathing, the taste of iron filling my mouth like I'd inhaled it myself. I said her name without meaning to. Ilara. The name lived at the back of my teeth behind the silence. She shouldn't have been here. She wasn't here. Not anymore. My comm crackled. Static rasped, jagged, chewing through the channel. I knew better. I should have shut it down, logged it as interference, but I waited. Her voice slid through like a knife between ribs. You're safe here. Every nerve froze. My hands, my chest, even my lungs. The words landed inside me like frost. Not a memory. Not a dream. Her voice. Alive. Present. Ilara had been dead a year. I remembered her face when I closed the hatch, the way she screamed when the airlock bled vacuum faster than the safeties could cycle. I remembered the impact, the quiet that followed, and the nothingness that was left of her. And yet here in the dark she spoke again. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The others didn't need to know. They wouldn't believe me, or worse, they would. Either way, I wasn't ready to hand her ghost over to them. I killed my comm. The silence pressed close. I kept moving, lamp swaying across cabinets, labeled in a language that seemed to rewrite itself each time my eyes passed over it. The med scanners hummed low, though they weren't connected to power. Their screens jittered with shapes that almost looked like rib cages. Almost. My boots scuffed through dust that was too thick to be dust, gray, fibrous, like hair left to rot in water. Each step made it cling to the grates and curl upward like it wanted to breathe again. I told myself the static was just bleed through from the power conduits. I told myself hallucinations were normal in stale air. I told myself not to look up again at the spray on the ceiling, but I did, and the red streaks glimmered wet under my lamp. I whispered her name again, quieter, as though afraid the walls would hear me. And then her voice came again, clearer, closer, inside the helmet itself, not through comms. You're safe here. It wasn't the channel this time. It wasn't the station. It was inside my suit. Sparks's voice was thin in the comms, jittery with static. Movement. Hydroponics wing. I swear I saw it. I wanted to dismiss it, call. A shadow, a trick of his lamp, but we followed anyway. In places like this, denial kills faster than hunger. The corridor bent left, then opened into the greenhouse, or what used to be one. My lamp washed across a sea of withered vines that sagged from their trellises in long strands. The roots had hardened into cords, dark and glossy, like tendons stripped from bone. The smell hit us first, humid rot, A sweetness turned rancid, clinging to the inside of my visor. I breathed shallow, each inhalation rasping loud in my ears. The plants weren't plants anymore. I saw it in the way they pulsed, cables threaded with veins, strands merging with the walls as though the station itself was learning to grow flesh. A droplet fell onto my glove. It wasn't water. It was thick, black, and when it struck the steel grate beneath me, it smoked faintly. Spark swept his beam up. That's when we saw it. A body hung from the ceiling, upside down, half consumed, fused into the vines. Its skin had taken on the same dull sheen as the roots, glistening, alive but not its own. The face was ruined, mouth stretched wide, eyes milked over. Its chest rose, fell, rose again as though still trying to breathe through lungs long past use, and then sound came. Not words, not really. The air was pushed through its ruined throat like wind through a broken flute. Hollow, wet, almost human. Stay. The syllable dripped out wrong, too slow, too deliberate. I froze. My mind caught between disbelief and recognition. For a moment I thought it had used Alara's voice. Sparks broke first. He screamed through clenched teeth and fired his cutter. The beam sliced clean across the thing's abdomen. The body split open like a rotten fruit, and black liquid spilled downward in a heavy gush. It struck the grates, hissing, eating into the metal with soft, hungry pops. I thought that would be it. But death didn't happen here. Not properly. The liquid didn't pool. It crawled. Tendrils shot outward across the floor, forming wet shapes, twitching with muscle memory. They wriggled together, joined, split apart, multiplied. Figures assembled from the sludge, forms with too many joints, limbs bending the wrong way, spines curving out where they shouldn't. The air turned heavy, thick with the stink of iron and ozone. Sparks backpedaled, cutter shaking in his grip. Vance muttered something about running. My own voice wouldn't come. I just stared, my throat locked, my mind screaming at my body to move and failing. One of the shapes paused. It stretched tall, limbs cracking into place like wet wood splintering. It leaned forward, no face but an impression of one, hollow and smooth. Then from deep inside its ribless chest came a whisper. My name. Not shouted, not spoken, whispered like a secret meant only for me. And in that moment I realized it knew me. The reactor room was hotter than it had any right to be. My visor fogged in bursts, little clouds that pulsed with my breathing, and the gauges flickered in amber as if already predicting failure. The walls sweated condensation. Droplets streaked down plating warped from too many power surges, hissing faintly when they hit the heat exchangers. The air was thick, sour with coolant and burned copper. Vance swore every few seconds as he knelt beside the primary seals. His gloves came away slick with something that wasn't water. Spark stood at the panel with his cutter drawn, though none of us said why. We all felt it, the pressure inside the ship's ribs, the way the metal seemed to flex when we moved. This whole thing's bleeding, Vance muttered, punching, his slate as if anger would make the readings change. Coolant's wrong. Pressure gradients are inverted. He looked up at me, face pale through his visor. It's like the core's breathing. I almost told him not to say it. Saying it made it true. The lights flickered, shadows rippling across the reactor's cylindrical housing. Somewhere above us, a vent whined. I thought it was airflow until I realized the sound was syncopated. A rhythm, like something dragging itself across the ducts. Vance cursed again, harsher this time, and then it happened. He jerked back from the coolant manifold, convulsing hard enough that his boots scraped across the deck. His hands clawed at his helmet, banging against the inside of his visor as if something was choking him. Then his breath fogged the glass, not white but crimson. Mist thickened, spreading in swirls until his entire visor glowed red from within. "Hold still!" I shouted, grabbing his harness. I tried to haul him back, tried to pin his arms. Sparks yelled for me to let go, but I didn't. Couldn't. You don't abandon crew until you have no choice. The visor cracked. A fine line spidered outward, glowing faint as if pressure inside was forcing glass against steel. His body went rigid, every muscle straining like wires pulled too tight. And then the visor burst outward. The thing that crawled free wasn't Vance. It wasn't anyone. It had no eyes, only teeth. Teeth carved into its skin, lining every surface of its face and chest, overlapping like scales. It slithered through, the hole in the glass as if his body had been no more than packaging. I staggered back, half dragging what was left of him. Sparks fired the cutter, but the beam caught nothing. The thing had already launched upward, vanishing into the vents with a wet scrape. For a long moment, only the hiss of coolant filled the room. Vance's body twitched once, hollow, collapsing inward as though everything inside had been cored out. His limbs folded in unnatural ways, weightless now. The reactor pulsed behind us, louder than before. A deep, resonant thud that vibrated through the walls, through my boots, through my chest. Like a second heart grafted to the ship. I didn't say it aloud. None of us did. But the truth pressed down on all of us. The station wasn't dead. It was hungry. We backed away, dragging what was left of Vance toward the door. Sparks muttered, something to himself. Words I couldn't catch, words I didn't want to. I thought I heard Alara's voice again in the static, but this time it wasn't from my comms. It was woven into the reactor's pulse, into the very air. Then the vents above shifted, grating against themselves. A whisper spilled through, distorted, broken by echoes, but unmistakable. Vance's voice, begging. "Help me." The sound came from everywhere at once. We were running out of air, and worse, out of nerve. Sparks wanted to keep digging. He said, "The command terminal might still hold the log. Proof of what had happened here." I wanted to leave. Every vent whispered with Vance's stolen voice. Every corridor breathed in rhythm with the reactor's pulse. But leaving empty-handed meant starving later. So we argued until the silence between words felt heavier than the words themselves. The captain's quarters were not like the rest of the station. No rot, no blood, no stench. Everything inside was untouched, as if time had been sealed off with the hatch. My boots left the first marks in a layer of dust that didn't belong anywhere else on this ship. The lamp swept across a bed too neatly made, a shelf of books that hadn't shifted despite the station's tremors, and finally a desk. On the desk lay journals, dozens, handwritten. I flipped one open, my handwriting, but it wasn't. The letters were jagged, impatient like mine, but they were wrong at the edges, like someone had traced them after watching me too closely. The words inside gutted me. They told stories I never lived. Pages about Alara, her screaming, her body torn from the airlock, her death, not once but again and again. Each entry a new version, as if her dying had been rehearsed until it became perfect. My stomach turned as I read. These weren't memories. They were predictions. No, recordings. I couldn't tell which was worse. The last page trailed off mid-sentence, ink blotched by a hand that must have been shaking. It read, "And now he reads this line, knowing the door will open." The air thickened. My lamp swayed toward the hatch. Behind me, metal hissed. The seal released. The door slid open on its own, and I hadn't turned yet. The deeper we went, the less it resembled anything built by human hands. Pipes lost their symmetry, curling like tendons. Plating shuddered under my boots, and when I pressed my gloved hand to the wall, it pulsed, slow, steady, like a vein beneath skin. Cold steel had become something grafted, bone welded into bulkhead, nerves strung with copper, muscle clamped in brackets. It wasn't machinery anymore. It was anatomy. We reached the heart. The chamber was cavernous, lit not by lamps or power strips but by a dull glow seeping from cracks in the floor. In the center stood the altar, if you could call it that. It was alien, impossibly old, yet fused into the reactor's skeleton as though it had always belonged. Biomechanical ribs curved upward, twisting into spires that pulsed faintly. The air smelled like ozone and blood. Around the base lay hundreds of helmets. Human, their visors, all spider-webbed outward, shattered from within. They stared at nothing. One rolled when I passed, catching the light of my lamp, and for a moment I saw Alara's reflection in the glass. She smiled faintly, too faintly, before her skin fissured like cracking porcelain. Then the image was gone. Spark stepped forward, muttering something about proof, about history. He reached out, his hand pressed against the altar's surface. It didn't reject him. It accepted. The surface melted around his palm, fusing. Cables slithered up his arm, burrowing beneath his suit. Veins of metal spread across his flesh, glowing faint blue, threading into him. Spark screamed, but even as he did, the scream bent into laughter, distorted, half human, half something else. Through clenched teeth and a voice not entirely his own, he said, "It remembers us." I couldn't breathe. The helmet seemed to turn with me, staring. The glow of the altar brightened. And then, without eyes, without face, it turned toward me. I don't know when I stopped trusting them. Maybe it was gradual, small movements, repeated too perfectly. Eyes shifting at the same moment, the same way. Maybe it was when Sparks laughed through his pain at the altar, his voice no longer only his. Or maybe it was earlier, when the journals in the captain's quarters described, me reading them, word for word before I had touched a page. Now every step they took looked rehearsed. Déjà vu wrapped around me like a second suit. I'd seen it all before, the turn of their helmets, the way their lamps swayed in tandem, even the rhythm of their boots on the deck. It wasn't synchronicity. It was rehearsal. I walked away before I could see more. I told myself it was scouting, checking oxygen lines, monitoring hull fractures. Lies. I just needed space from them. The observation deck was silent when I entered, a long arc of glass looking out into the dark. My lamp dimmed against the void, but the stars glimmered sharp, cruel, endless. At first I felt relief. Here at least was something constant. Then I noticed the spirals. The constellations looped back on themselves, folding into impossible geometry. Orion twisted into his own belt. The arc of the Milky Way collapsed into a spiral, eating its tail. The stars didn't move. They repeated, as if the sky were a recording skipping, showing the same few seconds over and over. My stomach turned, with the wrongness, like falling into orbit without gravity. My visor chimed, shrill and insistent. Oxygen warning, levels critical. But when I checked the gauge at my hip, it read full. 98% steady flow. I tapped the glass. The warning stayed, pulsing red across my vision. I pulled off my glove to touch the gauge directly. The needle was steady, cold under my finger. Still, the visor whispered low oxygen. Low oxygen. Low oxygen. I pressed my forehead to the glass, tried to steady my breathing. That's when I heard it. A humming, soft, tuneless, drifting through the deck like it had always been there. Familiar. Too familiar. "Ilara," I whispered. My comm was dead. I'd shut it off after the last time I heard her. But the sound wasn't in my ear. It was behind me. I turned. She stood there. Her body was pale, skin stretched thin, a hollow version of memory. Her chest was caved inward as though something had eaten her from the inside. Ribs collapsed like broken scaffolding. Her eyes held nothing. Yet she hummed, lips moving in rhythm with the sound that wasn't sound at all. "Choose better this time," she whispered. The words scraped through the air, layered with static, as if they'd been recorded and replayed too many times. Her shape flickered, edges unraveling into white noise. Then she dissolved entirely. Just gone, leaving the echo of her voice burning in my skull. I turned back toward the deck, heart hammering. The stars still looped, spiraling into themselves, uncaring. When I looked back at the others, they were there, standing in the doorway, silent, watching me, their helmets tilted in perfect unison. Their lips peeled back slowly, impossibly wide, and I saw teeth. Not theirs. Too many. Too sharp. They smiled. Sparks wasn't Sparks anymore. He stood in the corridor, helmet hanging loose around his neck, breath fogging against glass that was already cracked from the inside. Blue veins glowed beneath his skin, threading through his suit like circuitry, pulsing faintly in rhythm with the ship's reactor. Each beat illuminated him from within, as if his blood had been replaced by liquid light. When he spoke, his voice came in layers, half human, half machine, and half something else entirely. "The ship has chosen me," he said. His lips barely moved, but the words crawled across the comms as though broadcast on every channel. "It can choose you, too." He bent backward. His spine cracked audibly, joints popping in succession, vertebrae stretching into shapes not meant for bone. His body elongated until he towered over us, suit splitting in seams that spilled cables instead of flesh. The wires writhed, slick with fluid, slapping wetly against the floor. His laughter followed, echoing down the corridor, multiplied by the walls until it became a chorus. We ran. None of us said anything. Words wouldn't have mattered. The ship didn't let us flee quietly. Lights flickered overhead, each burst of glow catching sparks in another wrong shape. Arms too long, head bent backward, cables sprouting like roots dragging along the ceiling. His laughter bled through the metal, carrying from vents, from ducts, from beneath the deck plates. I stumbled into a viewport, chest heaving, trying to pull air that tasted more like dust than oxygen. My hands braced on the glass. For a second, the cold steadied me. Then I saw them, black filaments thin as hair threading beneath my fingernails. They pulsed faintly, twitching when I flexed. Infection, assimilation. I dug my nails into my palm until blood welled, but the threads didn't leave. They spread. It hit me then. The altar hadn't been killing us. It had been rewriting us. Every scream, every drop of blood, every mistake was another line of code in whatever organism this station had become. Behind me, Sparks roared, his voice now a warped symphony of static and laughter. The wall shuddered as if pleased. I looked back at the viewport. My reflection stared at me with hollow eyes, and then it blinked. Half a second after I did, the escape pods were supposed to be our way out. A last chance, ugly, cramped coffins that could spit us into the void and hope rescue came before the oxygen ran dry. But when I reached the bay, the pods weren't waiting for me, they were sealed. Every hatch locked down. The terminals glowed red with command overrides routed from the bridge. Not human overrides. The language pulsed in broken glyphs across. The screens jagged like veins alive, and the others were already there. They stood in silence near the pods, three shapes half-shadowed by the emergency strobes. Their eyes, no longer human, were black, depthless obsidian mirrors reflecting only me. For a moment I thought they were waiting to attack. Instead they spoke. "This isn't betrayal," they said together, their voices too calm, too steady. "It's survival." Each word landed like a hammer, synchronized, rehearsed. My heart tried to argue, but my brain knew better. There was no division between them anymore. They were one voice stretched across many throats. "You're the one. Cut apart," they said. "Your fear keeps you separate. Let go. Join us." I raised my cutter, my arm locked mid-lift. No resistance, no seizing pain, just absence. Like the limb had ceased obeying me. A whisper slid through my suit's comms. Not a voice, a directive. Assimilate. I hadn't authorized it. I hadn't given the order. The suit had chosen for me. Sparks, if the thing before me was still Sparks, stepped forward. His hand rose slowly, almost tender. He pressed it against my shoulder plate. The warmth spread instantly, radiating through my chest, my throat, my skull. It felt like Alara's touch, too familiar, too intimate. For a heartbeat, I almost gave in. Almost. The pods hissed, seals engaged. One by one, every pod clamped shut, steel jaws swallowing silence. The last hatch closed behind me, sealing me inside with them. No escape. No choice. only what the ship wanted. I stayed because the console still had a heartbeat, because the panel's cracked glass flickered like an eyelid, and the green diode in the corner refused to die, because the only thing that made sense in that breathing tomb of a ship was a row of keys under my hands, and the promise that signals obey laws even when people don't. So I braced my forearms on the cold edge, felt the grit of metallic dust grind under my sleeves, and keyed in a distress burst on wideband. Watched the waveform thread across the screen like a lifeline dragged behind a drowning man. Watched it dissolve into static and come back not as rescue, but as recognition. My own voice, flattened, stripped, saying in a calm I've never owned, "We are safe here." And then another voice underneath it, heavier, deeper, carrying rust and winter and the iron taste of old blood. She died a year ago, and my hands hung above the keys like broken tools, while the room hummed around me and the reactor thudded through the deck with that terrible biological rhythm, and I thought of the journals in the captain's quarters, the way my handwriting had predicted the door would open, the way it had told me how I would read it. And I remembered the med bay ceiling, the fan-shaped spray that only makes sense in airless rooms where bodies float before they burst, and I told myself to breathe, told my suit to ignore its own alarms, told the ship to stop listening, and I looked up because something in the periphery had changed. Because the light had shifted in that way your brain recognizes before your eyes agree. Because the temperature behind me climbed a fraction of a degree in the shape of a human standing inside my shadow. And she was there, Alara, alive and whole, but wrong in the angles, wrong in the light, wrong in the way her skin reflected the console's glow like it was painted on rather than lit from within. Wrong in the absence of fog on her visor when she breathed. Wrong in the soft crease at the corner of her mouth that I knew and loved and had watched unmake itself behind an airlock porthole. Wrong because memory is not a body and a body is not a memory. And yet she said my name the way nobody else ever said it. Gentle and precise. And the altar behind her, if altar is even a word for that welded shiver of bone metal and living geometry, pulsed like a star behind cloud, faint, then brighter, drawing a slow exhale from the chamber, as if the station had waited for us to reach this line and was relieved we'd finally stopped pretending there was another script to choose. And I told her she was dead, that I had closed the hatch, that the lock had failed in a way the manual said it couldn't fail, that the hiss of atmosphere through a hairline fracture doesn't sound like anything until it sounds like everything. And she tilted her head with a softness that killed me twice and said this wasn't death. This was return. That the words weren't for comfort but for calibration. And she lifted her hand, not with gravity's tug but with the patient stillness of a deep-sea thing rising toward a light it didn't understand. And she touched my shoulder through the suit, and warmth moved through me that wasn't mine. And wasn't the suit's thermal layer either. A warmth like remembered afternoons in metal you've held long enough to take your heat. And her voice softened in a way that made the reactor's beat slow to match it. And she said we weren't explorers. We were echoes. Our decisions already recorded, our screams already cataloged in a language we couldn't read. Replayed until the ship could stitch the cleanest pattern through the mess. And I wanted to argue, but the console helped her by unscrolling a manifest that wasn't ours and was. A column of names that included us and versions of us. Timestamps that drifted like satellites out of orbit. Entry after entry of a distress. Call answered by our own voices in eras that didn't exist. Dates that rubbed off under my eyes like chalk. And in the glass above the keys, I saw a reflection of the bay door where I'd watched it seal. Saw the line of light narrow to nothing, and the light in the reflection widened again as if time had reversed. As if mercy had a second rehearsal waiting, and the sound in the vents above me changed from the ragged scrape of teeth on ductwork to the soft slither of cables rearranging tendons in iron, and the altar's faint aura rose, the way a sleeping animal draws breath before it wakes. And I told Alara this wasn't her, that the ship was using her mouth because it knew the architecture of my doubt. And she smiled, that thin, deliberate smile that makes sadness look like strategy. And she said the words Sparks had choked through, his new voice. It remembers us. And I wanted to ask what it remembered first, the mouths or the names, the sequence of our failures, or the geometry of our hope. But the room had thickened into something like syrup, a sweet rot at the back of the throat that wasn't smell but memory put into chemical form, and I couldn't tell whether my visor was fogging for real or replaying a fog from a loop I'd already lived. And somewhere beyond the glass of the observation arc, the constellations turned in upon themselves again. Spirals folding into spirals, and the altimeter on my slate ticked down without the floor moving, and my pulse tried to match the reactor and failed, and the line of text on the console shifted languages until it arrived at my own cursive and wrote, "You already chose." And the screen blinked, and above it the PA, the ship's throat, worked once without sound as if warming up for something, and from the corridor behind us came feet, but not as footsteps, more a succession of points of contact, like a centipede, learning bipeds, and Sparks spoke from the doorway in that layered way that turns a human sentence into braid, saying the command deck had finished its authorization, that escape was sealed because escape is an old dream animals have before they learn about traps, and the altar hummed again, and every helmet on the floor around its base, the ring of smashed visors like a necklace on a throat, seemed to cant a degree toward us, seeking, praying, or only aligning, and Alara's eyes didn't blink. But I remembered their blink, and the memory did it for her. A phantom shudder, and the guilt came in waves, not as confession, but as geometry. The narrow corridor by the airlock, my hand on the lever, her gloved palm against the glass, the count of seconds in which a life is the difference between an O-ring's ambition and a manufacturer's tolerance, and the part of me that writes lists and counts oxygen and knows the cost of compassionate lies, said that choice had been an equation I did not build. And the part of me that loved her said it had been mine anyway, and the console crackled with my voice again saying, "We are safe here." And I heard what I hadn't heard the first time. The way safe sounded like kept, the way here sounded like held, and the waveform beneath it was not carrier noise but many other versions of me breathing, short, long, panicked, resigned, overlaid until they made a chord only machines can love. And I struck the panel with the heel of my hand, and the screen didn't crack because the ship did not believe in our theatrics, and somewhere above us it rained dust, not like debris but like ash falling back toward a hearth it belonged to, and behind the altar the plating bulged with a pulse and then went calm, and I understood with a cold clarity that settled the way truths settle when they have no audience. This was not a vessel. This was an organ of something larger, a shrine engine that records, rewrites, replays, a machine for turning travelers into language, for composting choices into instruction. And the reason the station drifted was because the cosmos was the rotating geometry around it, because the altar was the fixed thing and we were the debris. And Ilara lifted her hand again and brushed my jaw through the glass and my suit's biometric readout. The same one that had whispered, "Assimilate," into my bones, brightened a fraction, as if reward had been coated in warmth. And she said, "It can be different if you let it." And behind her the altar opened a slit along a seam that had not existed a moment before, not like a mouth but like a star's eyelid, a radiance with shape. And from that aperture came a sound I have only ever heard in dreams, a chorus of voices arranged into a single tone that felt like gravity looks. And the helmet ring on the floor trembled and shifted, and I noticed, with the restraint of a man reading the instructions on a bomb while seated upon it, that every one of those visors was smashed from the inside, pressure outward, not collapse, emergence not failure, and Sparks stepped nearer, not walking but letting the ship carry him the way tides carry driftwood, his blue-lit veins casting slick shadows through the torn seams of his suit. And he said the altar had an economy, that it did not waste death but harvested software, and the black filaments under my nails flexed like larvae excited by heat, and I thought of cutting my fingers off and knew I had done it before, because under my glove at the seam of the wrist, there were the smooth-edged scars of a person who had already tried. And the console marched out a list of attempts with failure codes that read like weather reports for storms nobody survives. Attempt 144, reactor overload, preempted by structural memory. Attempt 201, manual airlock override rescinded by future interlock. Attempt 312, self-termination rejected as non-informative. And the line that followed had my name and the text, attempt 487, consent achieved. And I told myself it was a lure, that the ship wanted a ritual, a yes in the correct tense, but the ship didn't want. It repeated until the pattern held. And that's different and worse. And Alara's breathing was too even, and the reactor's pulse was too patient, and the oxygen warning on my visor began flashing again, while the gauge at my hip held full, because the system wasn't measuring air, it was measuring compliance. The narrowing corridor inside me where refusal has to pass if it wants to remain refusal, and I took a half step back and my heel struck the lip of a helmet ring, and glass grated under my boot, and in the spider web of a visor's shatter, I saw her, face again, not as a haunt, but as a mathematical possibility that had been run to zero, and the crack spread and the face smiled and cracked with it, and the altar breathed in, drawing the warmth of the room through that seam, not suction, but invitation, and air moved across the floor in low ripples, and I tasted sweetness iced with metal, and there was a sound like a nail brushed down the string of a piano, and Sparks said, like a teacher praising a child who finally solved the simplest proof, "See? It remembers you." And for a second the light flooded to white and I saw without seeing an image that was not an image. The station not as structure but as fossil, a cathedral ribcage grown in vacuum around a corpus of instructions, ships visiting like insects, leaving like pollen, and a loop of me repeating a million small hesitations until they all added up to a yes, and I laughed then. Not for humor, for calibration, the way you cough to check a lung. And I said no, and the ship recorded it without judgment, and the console wrote, attempt 486. Denial recaptured, and Alara's head tilted again, and this time the tilt had a glitch at the end, like a video buffering across damaged time. And I understood the scale and the cruelty and the grace, that this was not malice but function, not a predator but a recorder. And if we were all to be broken down into data and braided through its tendons until it could carry us as song, then, in the only small corner of the universe where my consent still mattered, my mouth, my breath, my one refusal left like a pilot light, I held it like a knife and then felt it dissolve in my hand because the suit whispered the directive again, assimilate. And the warmth that was Alara became the warmth that was the ship. And the others appeared in the doorway, teeth that were not theirs peeking in deliberate smiles, patience shining where hunger would be in an animal, and the altar brightened to the rhythm that has always ended me. And I reached for the console not to send a signal but to touch the surface where my earlier handprint still gleamed in oil. And my palm fit there the way a tongue fits a missing tooth. And I said to the room, to Alara, to the ship that was the room, "What do you remember first?" And the answer wasn't an answer but a splice. Pain aligned to word, breath aligned to light. The map of us turned outward into a mouth, and in the ducts above the pleading voice that had stolen Vance returned in a minor key and said, "Help me," in 50 versions long and short, and somewhere out of sequence a bay door latched and a visor burst and a viewport blinked half a second late, and the stars outside performed their tired miracle for the 10,000th time, folding into themselves, like a bruise closing, and the station did not drift. It held and held, and the room felt smaller because my options had finished arranging themselves into a circle, and Alara took my hand and led it toward the seam, and I let it go because I wanted to see how the line was written when it was written, right? And the altar's light touched my glove and bled through in capillaries of blue, and the filaments under my nails twitched like they were tasting home, and I heard the distress console connect to a circuit that did not exist, and the speaker above the panel filled with a voice I knew down to its ruined hinge, mine, and it said the thing that closes all our circles, the mantra the ship uses to tuck us in, and the light increased and the helmets hummed like bowls and the reactor hit a downbeat so heavy it pressed my soul flat, and then I heard my own voice from the altar.